to everyone, and welcome to this online session on drug pricing organized by Lung Cancer Europe. So my name is Alfonso Aguaron, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Eric Low, owner and founder of Eric Low Consulting, founder and former Chief Executive Officer of Myeloma UK, as well as a person involved in many other organizations and initiatives, such as the Amyloidosis Research Consortium, Myeloma Canada, and some others. But beyond that, a very good friend of me who, for me and many advocates, has been lucky to work with since many years and learned a lot from his commitment to the benefit of patients. So Eric, on behalf of Lung Cancer Europe, I would really like to thank you for being with us here today and share your valuable time to touch base in such a burning and interesting topic like how drug prices are set. So before we get started, if this is the first time you have joined a Lung Cancer Europe webinar, I would like to explain you the session dynamics. So during the first part, Eric will make a presentation on today's topic, which will last approximately 30 minutes. And once the presentation is over, we will open a Q&A session in which you will be able to make your questions. There are basically two ways in which you can participate. If you would like to make your questions live by using your microphone, you just need to press the raise hand icon in the application you just downloaded to join the webinar. And I will unmute your microphone when it is your turn. In case you prefer to make your questions by writing, just type them in the Q&A or the chat window, and I'll pass it to Eric at the end of the session. So without further ado, I wish you all a very fruitful session, and Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alfonso. And Alfonso, can I just check that you can hear me? Because if you can hear me, I'm assuming everybody else can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. Well, Alfonso, as ever, great to work with you, and thank you for the invitation to speak. It's quite a daunting task to talk about drug pricing because it is a dark science that goes on in a shadowy world, and I'm not sure there are many experts out there. I'm certainly not an expert, but I'll do my very best to explain some background to kind of drug pricing and what the implications are of that for advocacy, particularly in lung cancer. So with that in mind, the objective of the session today is just to give a very brief overview of the drug pricing environment, or environments, because there is no one environment, and mechanisms sufficient to support your efforts locally, I guess, across Europe and globally, in your advocacy efforts in lung cancer, because I think a detailed and intimate understanding of drug pricing and the factors that influence that, I think, is key to advocating in the correct part of the system at the right time in the right way. So that is the broad objective. And I think that chimes quite nicely with what you guys are trying to do in terms of kind of upskilling and building capacity at a European level, but also at a European country level to, I think, be even more effective in terms of advocacy and how you can influence the agenda in lung cancer. So that's the objective. I hope we meet it. If we don't, I'm sure you'll tell me in the chat box. So really important, I think, just to do a bit of context and a bit of setting the scene. This is very basic stuff, so I apologize if most of you already know this, but it's no big secret that the biotech and pharma industry is profit making. And I don't think that should be a kind of big secret or a big surprise. Their job is to generate shareholder value. And generally speaking, they're pretty good at it. You know, drug companies tend to do very, very well. Their profits never seem to go down dramatically. And I think when you can compare their profits to other comparable industries, they do very, very, very well. So credit to industry for doing a good job in creating shareholder value. But it isn't just about shareholder value. It's not just about money, although I think that's the predominant aim. They also want to create value for other stakeholders across that sort of drug development continuum, and I think, you know, especially patients. And for the most part, they're okay at doing that. I think we've all seen evidence of where industry have created a data set to suit the needs of a regulator and not necessarily patients, and that's caused huge problems downstream in health systems and trying to get access to drugs. And I think it's incumbent upon us as advocates to advocate across the whole drug development continuum, not just at the point where a payer or an HTA archetype is trying to make a decision whether a health system should fund it or not. I think what's also important is that industry works within the rules and laws and policies that are set by governments. So industry are not necessarily making up their own rules of engagement. They work within the rules and laws and policies that's set by governments. I think in different jurisdictions around the world, I think the industry lobby is sufficiently good that it can influence these rules and laws and policies potentially in favorable ways. But I think that's an important indication of where our advocacy efforts need to sit, is of course they need to sit across the whole drug development continuum. But if we want real change to happen in favor of, or more in favor of patients, then we need to target the rule makers, the lawmakers, and the policy makers to create an environment that allows, I think, more winners than losers. But again, I think the industry are very, very good at working within the rules and laws that they're given. I think the other important backdrop to this is the complexity in the ecosystem. There are no easy wins here, and it's quite difficult to understand everything that's going on. And unless you understand enough about what is going on, it may be that our advocacy efforts fall on deaf ears. So I think it's important to sort of map out the different stakeholders that exist in the drug development ecosystem and try and figure out what each of their vested interests are, how they're incentivized, and how they are rewarded, because that drives behavior, that drives activity. And unfortunately for patients, that may lead to a kind of square peg trying to be squeezed into a round hole when it gets to market or gets to a health system, so that we're not sort of unified around common goals or common incentives. So I think that's another indicator for what type of advocacy we need. Is we need a system whereby there is some alignment between the different vested interests that stakeholders have, the different ways in which they're incentivized, and the different ways in which they are rewarded, so that we get more of the right type of innovation through the system quicker, with a stronger core value proposition, and to patients in a much more efficient and aligned way. And I think it's also important to stress that tensions exist between industrial and health system strategies and priorities. So most governments are interested in things like number of jobs, inward investment, and tax receipts, and they compete to get pharmaceutical industry investment for manufacturing, for research, clinical trials into their country, because it's a great way to stimulate economic activity, jobs, education, tax receipts. But that's a long way from the health system in these countries, especially if it's a taxpayer-funded health system, trying to balance the books, trying to manage costs, trying to maximize population health. And their priorities may be completely different from those of the industrial strategy, and that causes massive tension within countries. And that tension sometimes manifests itself in public arguments about pricing of new drugs. And we've seen that recently, particularly with cystic fibrosis, in almost every single European country, where there's been very public arguments about the price of cystic fibrosis drugs, for example. And it's true of other areas. And it's this tension that exists between health systems that are trying to manage a tight budget and allocate scarce resources, and the desire of governments to work with industry and to get their investment. So these are all important areas of context that ultimately influence how we think about drug pricing. In regard to drug pricing itself, I think it's no big secret that it's an ongoing and I would say fairly tense and difficult debate between a number of different stakeholders nationally and globally. And I think that lots of complexity and rights and wrongs sit behind this, but in general terms, I think what we're dealing with is a sort of trend towards very, very, very expensive drugs. And sometimes high cost drugs are justified, potentially, if you think about some cell and gene therapies that have the potential to cure, whatever cure means. It cures you from one thing, but it doesn't stop you getting something else. There's some cons to kind of gene therapies as well and uncertainties, but there's no question that drug prices seem to be rising dramatically and quickly, and that causes huge pressures for health systems and kind of health budgets. And there's always a debate about, are these prices excessive? Are they justified or are they not justified? And should we blame industry or should we blame government that allow industry to charge these prices? Or is it just incumbent upon health systems and payers to push back and say, well, you can think about a price any way you want, but actually the price you get is the price that we're prepared to pay for it. In the same way that if we go to the store or to the supermarket and a pint of milk costs 17 euros, they're not going to sell any milk. We will look for alternatives potentially, or we'll push back and say that price is not acceptable. And normally the price we pay for normal goods is a balance between demand and supply, and market forces arrive at a right price. That tends not to happen so much in healthcare. There is a disconnect between the prices that industry would like and the price that health systems are prepared to pay. So it's a big problem and a big and very complex debate. And I think that's set against health economics and the allocation of scarce resources. So if you put the US market to one side, most European health systems are funded largely by taxpayers, and therefore the budget is often capped. It's often limited, and therefore we need to think about health economics. And I guess the principles of economics generally is around scarcity, is that in many things in life, we don't have enough money or enough resources to do everything that we want to do. So even when we think about in our personal lives, I'm sure for most of us at the end of the month, when we get our salary in and we pay our bills, our disposable income was probably less than we'd want it to be, which means we need to prioritize and we need to make trade-offs about what we choose to do and what we don't choose and what we don't do, so that we maximize our quality of life, our health and well-being with the money that we have available at the end of the month. And these principles are exactly the same in most health systems around Europe. To some degree, there are differences, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, to advocate effectively in your country, you need to understand the nuances and differences that exist within different European countries in terms of how they spend healthcare resources, what their willingness to pay thresholds are, and what mechanisms and methods and processes they have in place to negotiate and think about pricing. Choice is another important principle in all of our daily lives. And of course, it's linked to scarcities. We need to make tough choices sometimes, and especially now where people are really struggling as a result of COVID, people are thinking, well, as a parent, I may go without 3 meals a day because I need to make sure my kids eat, or I will choose to put in new double glazing windows rather than go on holiday this year because the value and the importance of doing that outstrips the potential value and importance of going on holiday. So we all need to make tough choices because there's just not enough money, enough time, enough expertise and resources to go around. And the same is true in most healthcare systems, is they've got to make some very, very difficult choices. And I don't want to think about COVID too much, but of course, because of the pressure on health systems, there's been some really tough choices about who ultimately was admitted into intensive care, who got access to ventilators, for example, and who didn't. So there's always tough choices to be made. And of course, another important principle of economics is opportunity cost, which means that what do you give up or what do you forego based on your choices. So if you choose to go on holiday, you need to give up the double glazing. So if a health system chooses to spend, X billion on a CAR T drug for a relatively small population, because the budget is capped and they have limited resources, then we'll have to give up healthcare, health benefit, and health outcomes potentially in other parts of the system, which is difficult because we don't always want to make these trade-offs where there are winners and losers from a patient perspective. And I think that's quite important when we think about our advocacy efforts, that we may be successful in getting access to a lung cancer drug or a myeloma drug or a hemophilia drug, but it could potentially mean that some other patients somewhere else in the system today or in the future may go without state-of-the-art care as a consequence, and that's not fair. And to help health systems, particularly in Europe, there is some type of evaluation. So here it says economic evaluation, but that's only a principle in some systems in terms of how they evaluate the potential benefits and costs of a new treatment, for example. It might be budget impact, it might be a clinical evaluation, but there is some sort of evaluation that will go on, and there'll be some very specific methods and processes to help health systems do that, to assist them in making decisions about how they allocate their scarce resources. And their ability to do that is somewhat dependent on how much these new drugs cost. If they are very expensive and bring only marginal health gains, the health system's willingness to pay will be less. If they're relatively cheap but bring health benefits, the health system will fall over themselves probably to approve it. And if it's low cost and low benefit, they may say, well, what's the point? So these types of evaluations are incredibly important and have a direct influence on drug pricing. So there's different evaluation types around the world and even in Europe. So while there are moves to get alignment and some common principles around the assessment of new treatments, when it comes to pricing, then some countries take a different view on their willingness to pay, and will also have some local methodology and processes to take that evidence recommendation from UNETA, for example, and think about, well, what is its willingness to pay? And that could be based on a number of individual country factors, because there's a lot of demands for tax revenues. There could be infrastructure projects, there could be natural disasters, there could be COVID pressures, there could be issues around education, there might be issues around social care. So different countries have got different challenges in terms of how they allocate and spend their tax revenues. And most often, governments are democratically elected on the basis of a manifesto, and to the extent that they should, they have to implement that manifesto, and it may not always be the drug budget is the most important part of that manifesto. So there's lots of heterogeneity here, and that's somewhat represented on this slide, where there are different sort of country archetypes in terms of HTA evaluation and pair approaches. And of course, time does not permit me to go through this in any depth, but I'm sure as I've been waffling on, you've had a chance to kind of read this. So for example, there's a bunch of accountants that really think about it in the context of managing cost and the impact on drug budgets and the overall healthcare system, all the way through to evidence seekers. So irrespective of what it costs, if the evidence is there to suggest that the drug works and there's a degree of certainty around how it will work, then it may be that that's more important than the price. There are countries that are, just thinking about making deals that irrespective of price and value, they just want to make deals and so on. So I think that the kind of message here is that there's lots of complexity, lots of heterogeneity that underlies drug pricing at a country specific level. And if you're interested or if you believe that drug pricing is a barrier to you getting access to drugs at a local or a national or a pan-European level, there are many things that you need to know about, and this is one of them. You need to understand what type of evaluation does your country deploy in terms of its approach to drug pricing. And this is just another sort of cartoon, as it were, just to explain these different types of evaluation frameworks and how they differ across the world within Europe. So for example, in France and Germany, it's much more around the clinical benefits of a drug. What happens in Germany, as you know, and some of you will be more expert than me than this, is it tends to adopt new drugs quickly at a sort of price that the company wants, and then after about a year or so, they bring the company back in to do a clinical evaluation. France have a slightly different approach where I believe they have a scoring system, and based on some clinical attributes, you get grouped into a particular group, and then there's sort of a value, a price value that corresponds to each group, and that's broadly the type of price that companies will get, and it may come with some sort of budget cap that says this is the price you're getting, the total amount of volume you can spend is this, and if you exceed that, you come back in and we do another type of deal, all the way to Australia on the other spectrum, which is quite a tough place from a market access perspective, as they look at clinical, economic, and budget impact. So it's a very, very challenging environment in Australia to get access to drugs, and I would say they kind of ignore the company's desired price, and they use clinical, economic, and budget impact methodology to work with the company to agree a price that's appropriate for the healthcare system and the way in which tax revenues would like to be spent in Australia, for example. So again, the message here is that countries are very different, and you need to understand the factors that are at play in your country and how that impacts on drug pricing if you're going to use this to help get access to new medicines in your country. And of course, there's different willingness to pay thresholds. And again, there's different types of thresholds from a budget impact perspective or a clinical and cost effectiveness threshold, so a quality adjusted life year, or an ICER, but there's a willingness to pay of some sort in almost all countries, and depending on what that willingness to pay is, will determine how drugs are priced within your country. And then you can just see on the right hand side there is that generally it's around, what is the difference in cost and how much additional benefit are we getting from this new drug. And of course, where you get lower costs but improved patient outcomes, that will dominate and the willingness to pay threshold increases. But where you have higher costs and worse outcomes or marginally better outcomes, then the costs dominate and the price of the drug dominates, and that's where access issues come. And actually, from a patient protection perspective, you could argue that this is a good thing because we don't want high-cost medicines on the system that don't necessarily have huge benefits, and the probability of getting any benefit might be relatively small. And then you can see in the bottom there just how all of this manifests itself in different prices for different drugs in different countries. So I've kind of waffled on a bit, but the last few slides ultimately culminates in that table on the right-hand side, where depending on what's going on in each country and what methodology they have and what their willingness to pay threshold is, they will do different types of deals with different companies. So you can see, for example, Gleevec, in Germany, it's $3,000. In the UK, about $2,500, and I can't see it on my screen because something's covering it. But in the US, it's about $10,000. So I think that's where you see evidence of these different mechanisms and different industrial strategies, different willingness to pay thresholds, different methodologies to evaluate drugs come to play, that the prices that industry ultimately get can be very, very different. And this is why a little bit, and this is where I think advocacy needs to shift to a little bit. And although this is very much with a sort of UK lens on it, I guess the challenge that health systems are up against is around value for money. And again, we can explain this and think about this in the context of how we allocate our own scarce resources in the context of disposable income at the end of the month. That, for example, if we wanted to buy a new car and we rocked up to the dealership and we said, there's a sort of averagely priced looking, or that car looks average, therefore it should be averagely priced and affordable. Let's just say it's a Ford or a Skoda, brilliant cars, Skoda particularly, great cars, but they don't have the curb appeal necessarily that a Mercedes does or a kind of Porsche does. So you rock up and you love this car, and you've already bought it in your mind, and then the person that's selling the car says, well, that will be 150,000 euros, please. And you think, wait a minute, as good as a Skoda is, I'm not paying 150,000 euros for it. It's not absolutely critical for me to have a car. There's other options. There's public transport. There's cycling. That's a price that I would associate with a Porsche or a Mercedes, but I'm not getting all the benefits, real or perceived, that I would get with a Mercedes. I'm not sure I want to pay 150,000 euros because I'm not sure I'm going to get the value from that drug. I could get the same value by spending, a third of that money. And then just before, so let's say you're in a tight spot and you have no option, you have to buy the car, and just before you sign, the person that's selling it at the dealership says, well, by the way, there's only a 25% chance this car will get you home. So there's only a 25% chance this car will work and give you the benefits that its price tag promises. And even if it does get you home, it might not be a smooth journey. You might have trouble with the suspension. You might not be able to find the gear shift every time you need it. And the fuel economy is awful, so you'll need to fill up twice before you get home. Do you still want to pay 150,000 euros? And this is exactly what happens in healthcare. This is exactly what happens when drugs come to market. It's when each country thinks about that evaluation and thinking about opportunity cost and thinking about how to maximize health outcomes for the available budget. This often is the value proposition where a drug may work have a 25% chance working in 25% of patients, but there may be an 80% chance of grade 4 and grade 5 side effects. And the problem arises in part is because most companies generate evidence to satisfy the needs of the regulator. So that would be the European Medicines Agency, the FDA, or now the MHRA in the UK, because we've unfortunately, as you know, come out of Europe. And the data that they need to make their decisions is very different to the data that health systems need to make their decisions. And this is what we're up against. There's this huge gap and huge disconnect. And this is an important role and opportunity for advocacy, is to actually advocate for how we reduce this gap so that the data that comes to our health systems and ultimately gets evaluated is much more likely to meet the needs of that health system and its patients as much as it does the regulator. And until we do that, there's going to be lots and lots of tension and lots of argument and lots of delays around the value of new drugs, what price, how these new drugs should be priced. And ultimately, that's why patients often are either denied or are delayed getting access to potentially useful treatments. So I'm conscious that time is evaporating in front of us. So I guess I've tried to kind of tell a story here, which is a little bit about the kind of backdrop to kind of pricing, the issues and complexity and different drivers that are at play that impact on drug pricing. As a consequence of that, most governments and most health systems have had to put processes and methodology in place to make sure that they're paying fair and value-based prices for drugs based on their potential benefit and the certainty of getting that benefit weighed up against costs and side effects compared to what we already do in that kind of health system. So as part of that story now, there are a number of different mechanisms and different types of pricing that can be deployed and leveraged to try and get access to the market and ultimately so patients can get benefits from drugs. And I think there's so many different principles here, but it's beyond the scope of the time we have to get into in any depth. But two important principles, I think, is the US market and what's called anchor pricing. So that's drugs that are priced at the very highest point of what the market will withstand. So there's very few pricing controls in the US. You can basically think of a number and to some extent get away with it. And there's a thing called a pricing corridor, which basically means is whatever the price was for the previous drug in that disease or with a similar mechanism of action, you can lump an innovation premium on top of that and demand a higher price. And that isn't always the case in the US. Of course, there is some discussion and some pushback, but generally speaking, drugs are priced in the US to what the market will withstand. So it does push back, but the willingness to pay threshold is much, much, much higher in the US. That's beginning to change. Some health insurers are beginning to push back. And certainly there is ICER now, which is a sort of HTA type body in the US that does, really excellent evaluations of drugs and kind of through their methodology arrives at a value-based price. That might be, for example, $150,000, but the actual price that the company is getting and the price that the health systems and health insurers are prepared to pay maybe 750,000, for example. And then there's reference pricing, which is really, really important. And this drives a lot of early launch type pricing, is that not all countries negotiate on price, is that they are guided by a reference price, which is the average price that, for example, 8 or 9 different countries in a group will pay. And industry do quite a lot of work to ensure that the prices in these 8 reference companies are as high as possible. So the average price is as high as possible. And that's often the price that other countries just take or start their negotiations. So that is an important factor, or one of the important factors in how global pricing works. However, as we've just been discussing, is that because of the rise in cost of many medicines and because of the downward pressure on health health budgets and not being able to do everything, and there being many, many demands on that budget, it's important that health systems derive as much value as possible in terms of health benefits and health outcomes relative to the cost and price of a new drug. And to keep in mind that if it spends euros on one thing when the budget is fixed and capped, it cannot spend money on something else without that budget increasing or the health system going into debt and having a massive overdraft. So despite sort of anchor pricing and the influence of US pricing globally, and despite things like reference pricing, it's still massively challenging and complex for individual countries to think about its willingness to pay threshold, what methods and processes they want to put in place to get a price that's fair for their health system and to taxpayers. And that brings rise to a whole bunch of different types of creative pricing mechanisms. And I certainly haven't listed them all here. There are many, many more. And I don't have time to go into these in any depth, but I guess the objective in showing you this is that, you know, when you get off this webinar and you go back and Alfonso and colleagues start to run different educational days and different things, is this is the kind of thing that you need to get into and to kind of figure out which of these mechanisms are at play and work in your country, because different countries will have different tolerance levels for different types of pricing strategies. So there's a lot of heterogeneity and a lot of complexity that sits behind this that it's safe to say I'm not an expert on, and it's beyond the kind of remit of the webinar, but these are things for ongoing learning and education for all of us. So, I mean, there's no particular order to this, but there's things called a concept called value-based pricing, which has got many forms. And in a way, any type of economic, budget, or clinical impact assessment is a type of value-based pricing, which means that the price a company will be offered and the price that they will receive will reflect the value that new treatment brings to patients and brings to the health system. So that value, the perception of value, the value that a patient or a health system or a taxpayer or an HTA body attributes to the potential benefits and risks of a new drug is often very different to the value that a drug company will attach to it. So there's a methodology around, or different forms of value-based pricing that ultimately means that the price that a company gets and the way that a drug priced is relative to the value that that drug will bring locally to the health system and to the economy, to society, and of course to kind of patients. There's also a thing around a pricing concept called outcomes-based pricing, and that is a company will get paid different prices or a range of prices or incremental pricing based on the outcomes that are achieved in the real world. So there's sometimes a disconnect between, for example, the patient population that goes into a study and the population that will receive any given treatment in the real world in a country on a health system. And if the characteristics of these patients are somewhat different, then there's no telling that the patients in the real world will get the same benefits or have the same risks as the patients in the clinical trial. So that means there's uncertainty. That means there's a risk that if we spend X amount of money on drug A, we don't really know if we'll get the expected benefits. So that we can do some sort of creative pricing that means that if their drug turns out to work in the same way or better than the patients in the trial, and we can collect the data and prove these outcomes, then that then is associated with a certain price. And with all these pricing schemes and mechanisms, there's pros and cons, and there's different people that like different ones over others. So they all have their potential pros and cons. There's also something called indication-specific pricing, and this does happen in some European countries, but not in others, where if a drug comes to market in one indication, and there is a sense that the potential value of that drug in that particular indication is quite high, and then it comes to market for a new indication, and the value in that new indication is less than in the original indication, then the company should receive a different price, a lower price than the one it received for the initial indication. So for example, in the UK, companies are not allowed to do indication-specific pricing. They have to charge the same price for every indication. And if the price in the subsequent indication is lower than the original indication, the health system will put pressure on the company to pull the original price down to the lowest price. So lots of pros and cons around indication-specific pricing. There's also something around conditional approval. So for example, that may be where there is a willingness to pay, the kind of data stacks up, but there's still some uncertainty. So a drug will be approved with and offered a price with certain conditions. And conditions could be around, it could be based on outcomes. I mean, there's a whole range of conditions that health systems can put in place for a conditional approval. So it touches on outcomes, it touches on approval with evidence development, but there's certain conditions, and depending on whether these conditions are met or not, then the price may go up, go down, or stay the same. So for example, in England, and I'm sorry that this is somewhat UK-centric, but in England, they have something called the Cancer Drugs Fund, which is essentially conditional approval, where any particular drug is plausibly cost-effective, but not quite cost-effective enough to say yes to it. But there's a realistic chance that if it was given a conditional approval for a number of months or years, certainly not more than 2 years, that emerging evidence from ongoing studies or the evidence that was collected in the real world would be sufficient to prove the drug was cost effective, and therefore it would go on to routine commissioning. Again, lots of pros and cons to the Cancer Drugs Fund. As I've said, there's payment and prices with evidence development. So again, not dissimilar to the CDF and the Cancer Drugs Fund, where we'll approve your drug, however, at a certain price because you still don't have enough evidence. But if you continue to do the research in the real world and that evidence proves that your drug works and it reduces the uncertainty, then we can think about a different price discussion. And then this is a topic that's very close to my heart, and I know others, and is I guess an issue in lung cancer, is combination medicine pricing. So typically what happens is each drug that comes to market is priced individually and is priced and is subject to a sort of single evaluation or single technology appraisal in every country. But we know, particularly in oncology, that combination medicines are important. So based on this sort of scientific and biological scenario, that if you have 2 or 3 or 4 different mechanisms in a combination, then there may be some synergy, but it's not really about synergy. What it means is that it's knocking out different survival pathways in the system that keep the cancer or the tumor alive. But the problem is it's very difficult because it's sort of an incremental process where you start with 2 drugs, add a third, add a fourth, or add a fifth. And for each additional drug, the marginal gains diminish, but the price goes up. So it makes it very challenging for health systems to pay for combination medicines. And even if the new drug, so i.e. drug 3 or drug 4 in the combination, was given away for free, the whole combination may not be cost effective when measured or evaluated by budget impact, clinical impact, or cost effectiveness. So a big challenge and a big problem for health systems, and this should be an area that patient advocacy needs to try and support and influence. And there's other things like volume discounts, where it basically says, look, if we if we buy X amount of vaccines or X amount of tablets for the population, and we almost guarantee volume uptake, will you give us a discount? In the same way that if we go to the shoe store and we want to buy 5 pairs of shoes instead of one, we're going to ask for a discount. We're going to say, look, you know, if it's that price for one, do I get 20% off pairs 2, 3, 4, and 5? And that's exactly the same scenario. And depending on what stage in a drug's patent life or it is, different pricing opportunities come into play. So if a drug is generic or a drug is toward the end of its patent, then sometimes, as we saw in myeloma with lenalidomide, for very specific reasons, the price went up several times. Most advocate groups missed that and still continue to blame the payer and the HTA body around that. Or sometimes drug prices will come down, or the opportunity to do different types of pricing negotiations exist towards the end of a drug's kind of patent. So I think the cartoon here is very apt, because I think that this is how I started my career thinking about drug pricing, and this is exactly where I am at the moment, where it's very complex, it's very challenging, there's lots of different things at play, and how you see the debate manifest itself in newspapers and in news stories around, you know, patients being denied access. Once you scratch beneath the surface, it's very, very complex. There's lots of factors at play here that manifest itself in how health systems and governments think about drug prices and willingness to pay. And I think for effective advocacy, understanding that in the right way and appropriately is going to be super important in how we think about using advocacy to transform the lives of the patients that we are advocating for. So this is my last slide. You'll be very, very pleased to know. And hopefully I'm on time, Alfonso. You've not shouted in my ear. So what are the implications of drug pricing for advocacy, assuming that we begin to unpick it, unravel it, understand it, and get a sense of all the different factors and complexities at play? What does it mean for us? Well, I think for me, throughout my entire career, and this has continued now, it will continue in the future, I'm constantly having to rethink where I advocate, who I advocate to, and what I advocate for, and with what tools do I need to be able to advocate effectively and successfully across the entire drug development, drug evaluation, drug optimization system, in order that I generate the best outcomes for the patients that I represent. I guess in order to do that, I'm not sure it needs an intimate understanding, but it needs a sufficient understanding of all of the factors at play. And I think that adds massively to the credibility of advocacy, that if you can sit as a peer and an expert round a table with health economists, policymakers, payers, commissioners, and you have an understanding of their business, their challenges, their constraints, and you reflect that in your advocacy narrative, is very important. And as I say, you don't need to be expert in it, but you need a sufficient understanding to be seen as an equal. And when you speak and advocate, people will listen to you and will hopefully change the way they think about the decisions they make. I think while we have to work at a global level, because a lot of decisions about evidence generation are made in the US for the FDA, at a European level, there's opportunities and initiatives to engage in Brussels, in UNETA, and FPIA. All of these groups and areas are a legitimate target for informed and evidence-based advocacy. But ultimately, you also need to know your local, national and local or regional pricing and policy environment in your country, because it's like a layer cake. There's very many different layers in which you need to advocate to make sure that your patient group is getting access in your country. And it may be that a particular hospital has its own methodology and processes for drug pricing and access, or a bunch of hospitals get together regionally to do it. It may not always be done at a national level within countries, and increasingly countries are getting together to do some of these evaluations and pricing negotiations. So Benelux and Ireland have attempted to join together and try and do commercial deals with companies. I think that we've got to create a collaborative roundtable or virtual roundtable. We have to work with all stakeholders. And I think the biggest role or one of the biggest roles for advocacy is to work with industry and to work with academia to help them think about how they generate evidence. Because I think if we improve clinical trial design and designs, if we think about a broader evidence package, if we think about broader evidence domains, patient preferences, burden of disease, natural history, carrier dish utility, as well as clinical data, i.e. PFS or the tumor shrinks by this much or whatever it might be, so that we're bringing through a high quality, targeted and holistic data set. When health systems ultimately get hold of that data and do their evaluation, if we're more certain about the performance of a drug in relation to its costs and side effects compared to what we do now, then sometimes the discussions around pricing are easier. It's where there's a less obvious benefit to these drugs that all of the trouble comes in, and that's normally where patient advocacy is asked to kind of come in, and that's very, very difficult at that stage to do anything meaningful. So getting involved with your stakeholders early, promoting early engagement, making everybody part of a solution, not a problem, co-creating evidence, involving downstream decision makers in the design of that evidence, and or the research that will generate the evidence, are all really important things for advocacy groups, and that will have a direct impact on the drug pricing debate. And one of the things that we can do as advocates and patient groups that all other groups find difficult to do is getting the patient level data, because we're in touch with patients, we've got access to patients, and therefore we should be thinking about generating data about their values, their preferences, their perspectives, their burden, their dish utilities, the things that are important to them in terms of endpoints. And unfortunately, there aren't many therapeutic areas that have that data, and therefore they struggle to impact that drug development continuum. So that's an area that I think when you work back from how drugs are priced, us having that data, we can start to really influence and shape that debate in ways that we've not been able to do before. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that was somewhat helpful. I hope we met our objective, and I think just keep in mind that that was a whistle-stop tour, because this is a very, very complex and difficult area, and even if we had a week to discuss this, we may still not be any further along the knowledge curve than we are now. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think it has been very, very, as always, great to listen to you to talk about this tricky topic and sometimes rough to understand for us and advocates. And I think you have been pretty clear, and you make a really comprehensive presentation. I was wondering, because the presentation was a little bit longer than expected, whether I don't know whether you have another commitment or whether we might steal 5 or 10 more minutes from your time, because we have received some questions.
Yeah, I apologize for going over, but I will stay on.
Okay, thank you so much. So I will start. I will just remind you that some of you already have sent your questions by writing, but in case you would like to make your questions live, just remember that you can press the raise hand icon. So I will unmute your microphone, and you will be able to make your questions live. So I will pass you the first question we received, which says lung cancer survival outcomes have improved in the last year with the discovery of new drugs, especially immunotherapy and targeted therapies. However, these drugs seems to be very expensive, and same happens with many different drugs for cancer and other chronic diseases. In general, do you think health systems are prepared to provide access to innovative drugs and remain sustainable, or this will become a major problem soon in Europe?
Yeah, so it's a great question. There's several parts to that question. I would say in general, the ability of health systems to pay high prices for new drugs with marginal improvements will become increasingly challenging. And that is why almost all countries now are putting in place some degree of evaluation process, whether it's budget impact, clinical and cost effectiveness, or clinical impact, because they recognize that they cannot afford to pay the prices that industry want for their drugs. And it's that careful balance of trying to arrive at a fair price or a value-based price that's commensurate with the potential benefits that a drug has and the probability of getting that benefit, and at the same time to leave money in the budget to pay for other health interventions. So there's no question that, you know, in some cancers, lung cancer, myeloma, we have seen, you know, incremental improvements in survival and quality of life. But it's going to become increasingly more challenging to pay, you know, higher prices for new drugs that are in the pipeline. And this is a global problem.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. So we have another question which says, on the light of the news about the approval of remdesivir for the treatment of COVID-19 and potential new expensive treatments and vaccines coming in the near future, what's your opinion on how this might impact access to drugs for other diseases?
Yeah, it's another really terrific question. And if you think about what's happened with COVID, is that prior to COVID, budgets were very tight and budgets were capped. And there was very difficult negotiations about access to drugs. And all of a sudden, there's a pandemic and a money tree suddenly appears, and health systems pretty much have been throwing money at the problem. And most of that will be met by increased borrowing from governments that could lead to some types of austerity. However, the flip side to that is most health systems have gone through around a decade or 2 decades of evolution in 4 months, which means that they've become incredibly efficient. So, you know, telehealth, for example, is a good example of where not all patients now need to go to hospital. They're making different decisions about what types of treatment patients get. And that has freed up a lot of healthcare resources and budget in many health systems. And to some extent, that has balanced out some of this borrowing and additional investment from governments in to kind of meet the COVID crisis. What's more is what COVID has demonstrated is that when the problem's serious enough, stakeholders can get around the table and they can do deals and they can reach agreement on pricing and give discounts and give incentives that aren't normally present in normal circumstances. So I think there's a lot of learned behavior that we need to lock down and take forward based on COVID. However, a lot of people are concerned that because we've spent a lot of money, that means that there may be less money left in the system 12 months from now to pay for other drugs, and that therefore the willingness to pay threshold may go down considerably, because at some point we have to balance the books. Or if companies are not prepared to do the same level of collaboration and negotiation for a drug in lung cancer or cystic fibrosis or hemophilia that they demonstrated 6 months prior for COVID, then health systems might be a bit upset about this and really start to push back. So it's a really good question, and it's an area that I think advocacy groups need to think about carefully, is what does that post-COVID environment look like? What types of new learned behavior do we want to lock down and keep, and how can we leverage that from an advocacy perspective to improve things for our patient group? But which ones should we be worried about that may impact negatively on us getting access to medicines, or in terms of doing the type of research that we need to get the evidence we need to improve that kind of core value proposition, because there may be less money in the drug budget in the future. Willingness to pay thresholds may go down massively, and that may manifest itself in more difficult discussions around drugs for lung cancer or breast cancer or whatever it might be.
It's certainly a very good answer, and I think COVID has brought challenges in many different areas for advocacy groups, and of course access is also one of them, as you mentioned. So next question. Well, there are a lot of messages here thanking you for the presentation, say that it was pretty good, so I wanted to pass them to you. And the next question says, hi Eric, you talked about patient groups' needs to try to reduce the gap between regulatory and HTA evidence. What would be one or two concrete activities you would see as a focus once to decrease the gap you were talking about?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first thing is that even though we're European, our advocacy efforts need to influence US decision making, because the decision about clinical development programs and trial designs are almost, not always, but almost always made in the US, because the big market is the US. So 50% or more of all industry revenues come from the US market. So they could be very profitable without even thinking about coming to Europe. So one thing would be to find ways to influence that US decision-making construct. So that's one thing. The second thing is to think about, in spite of that disconnect, what can be done locally or regionally to generate additional evidence in a strategic and targeted way that you think might bridge that gap. So for example, if you need comparative effectiveness data, i.e. the standard of care arm in the regulatory study is different to the standard of care arm in your country, could you persuade academics to design a trial, a companion study or a hybrid study that has the right comparator in it that will help the health system understand better the potential benefits of the new drug viewed through the eyes of that kind of health system? Or if, for example, in the phase 2 or phase 3 regulatory study, they don't have enough endpoints, they don't have some good quality of life endpoints or patient-reported outcomes, do you have enough time and enough resources to work locally to get additional data that will help improve the core value proposition, reduce uncertainties, and to be able to articulate the potential value proposition of your drug in the context of the things that are important to patients that weren't captured in the regulatory study. So that would be the second thing, is to look at that local or regional sort of mitigation, risk adapted evidence generation program.
Thank you very much, Eric. I have 4 questions left, so I'll try to go fast with them. So next question says, can the active participation of European patient organizations in providing verified and validated data on the difference between countries make a big difference in having a close and equal price for a drug, improving access to it?
Alfonso, just to let you know that
Yeah.
I can't hear you, so you'll need to start that
Oh,
question again. Sorry.
okay. I'm sorry. I will speak louder. Maybe there's a problem with my microphone. So can you hear me clear now?
Yeah, thank you,
Okay.
Alfonso.
So the question says, can the active participation of European patient organizations in providing verified and validated data on the difference between countries make a big difference in having a closed and equal price for a drug, improving access to it?
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. I think to a point, and again, it goes back to that layer cake, is that that type of evidence and that type of data can potentially impact decision making at some stages in the continuum with different audiences. Um, but there will still, so for example, that type of data would be massively helpful when UNETA are doing their joint uh, uh, appraisals, for example. But then there's still that additional layer is what does the individual country, how does it then interpret that guidance, and what additional methods, processes, and barriers exist at a local or regional level. And therefore, that's where you need country-specific data, because I think what the health system wants to know is, I get it, I can see the potential benefits from a European patient perspective, but you need to express the potential benefits of this drug in the context of, Slovenian patients or Italian patients, because that's what we're paying for. So it's that layer cake, is that sort of that sort of comparator data at a European level really important, but then you need to then articulate that local data to local decision makers at, at the same time.
Thank you. Last question. So next one is, what's your opinion on UNET proposal on HTA joint assessments? Do you think it is realistic to have a European common assessment procedures, keeping in mind that every national market will make decisions at country level when it comes to price?
Yeah, so it's another good question. So I think that joint assessments using common principles, I think, play a very, very important role in the sort of the decision-making construct. And I think there's several reasons for that. However, because each, at least for now, each Europe health is devolved, and each European country is democratically elected on the basis of a manifesto, and I'm talking just very high level here, it's still down to that local country to interpret and act on the recommendations that come out of UNETA. So, for example, at any given time, the willingness to pay threshold in Italy may be different to that in Spain. And that's up to that government. It's up to society to decide how any government allocates its tax receipts. And it's very difficult, despite best intentions, to get that equal throughout Europe. So if you're a European citizen, for example, you should get the same drug for the same price regardless of what country you're in. It doesn't quite work like that yet. So I think UNETA play an important role, but it's only one part of solving the problem.
Great, thank you very much. So the two last questions, the next one is pretty straightforward, and it says, what are the main reasons for why medical care and drugs in particular are so much expensive in the United States compared to Europe?
I think because of the health system in the US, and again, it's very complex, and I'm not an expert, but the health system in the US is insurer based, and there are particular sort of cultural and legal perspectives around capitalism in the US, and the lack of interference of government in demand and supply in the economy, um, that influence the way that drugs are regulated and priced. So what you see now is an increasing trend towards the FDA approving drugs earlier and earlier. So it's not unusual now for a drug to be approved after a phase 2 study. And that study is quite often a single arm study in small numbers of patients with very limited follow-up, which is actually worse than knowing nothing about the drug. The fact that you know things about it bring in all kinds of uncertainties. But because the US market has a hunger for innovation and a hunger for making money, it wants to pull innovation through the system as quickly as possible. And once it's approved by the FDA, there's more or less freedom to price and freedom to use that drug, provided that you have insurance. In Europe, it's very, very different. You know, we're trying to allocate tax receipts. We're trying to maximize population health. We're trying to balance the health budget with the social care budget, with the education budget, with the military budget, with overseas aid, with giving money to Brussels. There's all kinds of different demands on our tax receipts, which means that our willingness to pay is very, very different. Our ability to pay is very, very different, and that manifests itself in lower drug prices in Europe and a different level of scrutiny over the potential benefits and risks of a drug just beyond sort of safety and efficacy.
It's great answer, and I think it really connects very well with our last question, which comes from, I assume, an advocate, which says, for many years I have heard from pharmaceutical industry that the reason of high prices is mainly to get back the investment done for developing a drug, and that only a few drugs are approved to be marketed, and that developing a new drug takes years and years. Have there been approaches out there to speed up the drug development process? I assume speeding up the development of new drugs should lower down the process. So that's the question.
Yeah, so because I don't know who's listening here, I need to be kind of careful. But I think that just be very careful about that argument. I think that's an argument that has been used time and time again by industry, that prices are necessarily high because of the R&D costs, or because the failure rate of other drugs. And I think there's sufficient evidence out there to say that most of that is just mostly nonsense. I would say it doesn't always cost billions to develop a new drug. I can think of several Me Too examples. I can think of things in myeloma, for example, that were derived from thalidomide. It's not true. And of course, most companies will never publish their. I mean, this is what some people ask for in terms of thinking about their pricing mechanisms. If that's what you say, tell us how much it cost you to develop the drug, and we will offer you a price that's commensurate with that cost. So it isn't always about that, but it's also about risk taking. If you're an investor and you're investing in a high risk business, then when it works, then the rewards need to be substantial, because you don't get them all the time. There are a lot of failures and you need to wait a long time to get them. So again, it comes back to sort of market forces. It comes back to capitalism. It comes back to the kind of government rules that if you're going to invest in science and in drug development, because of the failure rate, and some failure rate is due to bad decisions, badly designed studies, but science is complex. We know very little about the body and about biology, so some drugs don't work. So you do have to make your money on the drugs that work and within its patent lifetime. But I think that's a stretch to say that high prices are justified all of the time because of these circumstances. But the other thing to think about, though, is, and this is part of that macro ecosystem, it's that probably around 20 to 25% of all pension funds are invested in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. And I think we all want to have a decent standard of living when we retire. So it's a very difficult sort of macro and micro and meso economic challenge here to get that equilibrium, that good balance between demand and supply, so that we're paying the right prices for the right type of innovation, the right type of health gain that allows the pharmaceutical industry to thrive, to be profitable, to reinvest, to reward its shareholders, but also to make sure that society as a whole benefits through a decent pension that allows people not to be in poverty when they retire. So it's a complex ecosystem. And as we said before, that the sort of vested interests, the incentives and the rewards are not aligned. And I think the big challenge for society and for policy and for advocacy is, if we can get things aligned, and if we can get proportionality and appropriateness of every stage, then we should be able to create a system in which we are efficient in drug development, that we're generating value for everybody in the ecosystem in an equal and fair way. And I think that has to be the combined target of all our advocacy efforts.
Right. So thank you so much, Eric. That was the last question, a tricky one, I guess. And I mean, it seems I really appreciate that you stayed for a little longer. I think we could be talking for hours and hours about such an interesting topic. And before we close the session, I would really like to thank you again for sharing your time with us today and for giving us such a comprehensive and clear presentation on drug pricing. Also, I would like to thank you all for attending the webinar today, and just take the chance to remind you that you can stay connected to our social media channels in Facebook and Twitter. And also, I strongly recommend you to visit our website, especially our member section, to contact your local patient group in case you haven't done it yet. I really hope that you have enjoyed this session, and I really look forward to meeting you soon in our next webinar. So I wish you all a very good evening. So thank you very much, Eric, once again, and goodbye and good evening to everyone.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.